Hey everyone. Before my world fell apart, my life seemed perfect, almost idyllic. My husband was my partner in every sense of the word. He wasn't just a man who provided for his family. He was a rock, a protector, and a deeply loving father. We were high school sweethearts who had grown together over the years, weathering life's challenges side by side. 20 years of marriage had created a bond that seemed unbreakable, or so I thought. We had 4 children who were the center of our world. Our 2 boys, aged 18 and 16, were strong-willed and independent, but they adored their father and respected his every word. Our twin daughters, 13 at the time, were the light of his life, and he doted on them endlessly. My husband wasn't just a father. He was their hero, a figure of strength and love they could always depend on. Our home was a sanctuary filled with laughter, warmth, and love. My husband would often organize family dinners, outings, and even small surprises to keep the spark alive in our relationships. He had a way of making each of us feel special, no matter how hectic life got. I remember how he would come home after a long day at work and still find the energy to play with the kids or help them with their homework. He was the kind of father who attended every soccer game, every school recital, and every parent-teacher conference, even if it meant sacrificing his own time. Despite all this, something inside me began to change. Over the years, I started to take him for granted. His consistent love and unwavering support became so routine that I stopped appreciating it. I stopped seeing the little things he did for me, like leaving notes on the fridge that said, "Thinking of you," or surprising me with flowers just because it was a Tuesday. Instead of feeling cherished, I began to feel stifled. Physically, I had gone through my own transformation. I started working out rigorously, shedding weight and toning my body in ways I never thought possible. I went from being 180 pounds to 135, and while the change brought me confidence, it also created a distance between us. My husband, always supportive, joined me on this fitness journey, dropping significant weight himself. But even as he grew more physically attractive, I found myself pulling away emotionally. Our intimacy suffered as a result. While he remained passionate and eager to connect, I found myself withdrawing. I didn't know why at the time, but his touch, once comforting, started to feel invasive. I convinced myself that I was simply going through a phase, perhaps even early menopause. But deep down, I knew the issue wasn't physical. It was emotional. My husband, ever the problem solver, noticed the shift and tried to address it. He suggested date nights, weekend getaways, and even couples therapy, but I dismissed his efforts, brushing them off as unnecessary. I didn't want to face the reality that something fundamental was changing in our relationship. I had everything a woman could ask for: a loving husband, wonderful children, and a stable home. But I felt an inexplicable void. That void became the breeding ground for my downfall. I started spending more time at work, using it as an escape from the tension at home. It was during this time that a new manager joined our office, a younger, confident man who exuded charm and charisma. At first, his flirtatious remarks annoyed me, but as the weeks passed, they began to feed into the insecurities I had buried deep within myself. His attention made me feel desirable in a way I hadn't felt in years, and I found myself drawn to him despite knowing the consequences. My husband, on the other hand, remained oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. He continued to shower me with love and affection, believing that our marriage was unshakable. His trust in me was absolute, and that trust only added to the guilt I felt. But instead of addressing the issues, I let them fester, convincing myself that I deserved to feel special, even if it meant looking outside our marriage. Little did I know that this seemingly harmless attention from my manager would set off a chain of events that would destroy everything we had built over 2 decades. The perfect family I had always taken for granted would soon crumble under the weight of my selfishness. It began innocently, or at least that's what I told myself. The new manager at work was charming, confident, and persistent. At first, I ignored his flirtations, brushing them off as harmless office banter. But as the days turned into weeks, his attention became harder to resist. He complimented my appearance, noticed the little things about me, and made me feel like the center of his world, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. I told myself it was harmless, that I was just enjoying some attention. But deep down, I knew I was crossing lines. What started as casual conversations turned into private lunch meetings, filled with laughter and a connection I hadn't felt with my husband in years. I began sharing personal details about my life, how I felt unappreciated at home, how our intimacy had dwindled, and how I longed for something more. Every word I spoke to him was a betrayal, but I didn't stop. When he leaned in one day during lunch and kissed me, I didn't pull away. That single moment of weakness turned into an addiction. Soon, I found myself sneaking away during work hours, lying to my husband about late meetings, and planning rendezvous with my manager. At first, the guilt was overwhelming. Every time I came home, my husband's loving eyes and our children's laughter reminded me of what I was risking. But over time, the guilt faded, replaced by the thrill of the affair. I became a different person, more daring, more reckless. My lover's touch awakened desires I hadn't felt in years, and I threw myself into the affair with abandon. At home, the distance between my husband and me grew wider. He tried everything to bridge the gap, from planning romantic evenings to suggesting couples counseling. But I dismissed his efforts, often snapping at him for no reason. I even began to criticize him, pointing out flaws I had never noticed before. One night, after a particularly heated argument, he tried to kiss me, and I instinctively recoiled. The disgust on my face was unmistakable, and he saw it. His eyes, once filled with love and trust, reflected a deep, unspoken pain. He didn't say anything that night, but I could feel his suspicion growing. Despite the tension at home, I couldn't stop seeing my lover. Our meetings became more frequent, more intense. I did things with him that my husband had always begged for but never received. The contrast between my passion with my lover and my coldness toward my husband was glaring, and I knew it wouldn't be long before my secret was exposed. Little did I know that my husband's patience and restraint were wearing thin. His love for me, though still strong, was slowly being consumed by suspicion and anger. The storm was building, and it was only a matter of time before it would erupt in violence that would forever change our lives. The day my husband discovered the affair is etched into my memory like a nightmare I can't escape. He had planned a surprise, a romantic lunch and a weekend getaway to the Catskills, hoping to rekindle the spark in our marriage. But instead of finding me alone at home, he walked in on a scene that shattered him to his core. I was in the guest room with my lover, completely lost in the moment, when the door slammed open. The look in my husband's eyes was terrifying. Rage, betrayal, and heartbreak all at once. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His expression spoke volumes, and for the first time, I realized the depth of my betrayal. My lover scrambled off the bed, fumbling to pull on his clothes, but my husband didn't give him the chance. He charged at him like a bull, tackling him to the floor with a force that shook the room. Before my lover could react, my husband's fist connected with his jaw, the sickening crunch of bone echoing in the air. The violence was relentless. My husband pinned him to the ground, his fists raining down with unrelenting fury. Blood splattered across the floor, staining the carpet as he broke my lover's nose with a brutal punch. The sound of flesh meeting bone was deafening, each blow more savage than the last. I screamed for him to stop, but he was deaf to my cries. My lover tried to fight back, clawing at my husband's arms, but it was useless. My husband's strength, fueled by rage and betrayal, was unmatched. He grabbed my lover by the collar, dragging him to his feet only to slam him into the wall. The drywall cracked under the force, leaving a gaping hole where his head struck. Desperation overtook me, and I lunged at my husband, trying to pull him away. But he shoved me aside like I was nothing, sending me crashing into the nightstand. My head hit the corner, and for a moment, the room spun. When my vision cleared, I saw my lover on the ground, barely conscious. His face was unrecognizable, swollen, bloodied, and mangled. My husband stood over him, panting heavily, his fists dripping with blood. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, locked onto mine. There was no love left in them, only anger and pain. "You did this," he hissed, his voice trembling with emotion. Realizing what he had done, he stumbled back, grabbing his phone with shaking hands. 9/11. I need help, he said, his voice cracking. I think I killed him. My wife. She cheated on me and I lost control. The paramedics arrived within minutes, followed by the police. My lover was rushed to the hospital, barely clinging to life. My husband, his hands still stained with blood, dropped to his knees and surrendered without a fight. As the police handcuffed him, he looked at me one last time, tears streaming down his face. That was the moment I knew my life was over. The man who had loved me unconditionally was gone, replaced by a broken, devastated shell. And I was the one who had destroyed him. The fallout from that fateful day was swift and devastating. The once harmonious family I had cherished, or at least taken for granted, crumbled under the weight of my betrayal. My husband, the man who had stood by me for 2 decades, was gone, both physically and emotionally. He sat in a jail cell, his hands bloodied from the violence he unleashed, while I was left to face the wreckage of what I had done. The whispers started almost immediately. News of the incident spread like wildfire through our community. Friends, neighbors, even acquaintances began to look at me with a mix of pity and disgust. The details of the attack were graphic and horrifying. My lover's face had been so savagely beaten that it required reconstructive surgery. His jaw had been shattered, his cheekbones crushed, and his eye socket obliterated. The doctors later said that the damage was so extensive they couldn't piece together fragments of bone. At the hospital, my father didn't say a word to me. He simply stood in the doorway, staring with a mix of disappointment and disdain before walking away. My brother, however, was far less restrained. "How could you?" he yelled, his voice shaking with anger. "How could you do this to him? To us?" His words hit me like a sledgehammer, and I could do nothing but stand there, silent and ashamed. My in-laws were equally unforgiving. My husband's sisters confronted me in public, calling me a disgrace and threatening to harm me if I ever came near their family again. His mother, a woman who had always treated me like a daughter, spat in my face when I tried to apologize. "You destroyed my son," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "I hope you're happy." But the worst pain came from my children. My eldest son, once so close to me, refused to speak to me at all. He packed his bags and moved in with his grandparents, leaving without so much as a goodbye. My other son, though still living under the same roof, locked himself away in his room, emerging only when absolutely necessary. The twins, my sweet daughters, turned rebellious almost overnight. They shouted, slammed doors, and openly defied me at every turn. The silence at home was unbearable. Meals were no longer a time for laughter and connection. They were awkward, tension-filled affairs. My children would grab their plates and retreat to their rooms, leaving me to eat alone at the table. I cried myself to sleep most nights, the weight of their disdain crushing me. I knew I deserved it, but that didn't make it any easier. As my husband's trial approached, the true extent of the damage became clear. I had destroyed not just my marriage, but also the bond between my children and their father. The prosecution painted him as a violent man, someone capable of savage brutality. They played the 911 call in court, a 25-minute recording of my husband sobbing, confessing to his crime, and begging the operator for help. "The love of my life cheated on me," he said, his voice breaking. "I think I've killed him." Listening to that call was soul-crushing. My husband's pain was raw and unfiltered, and it was all because of me. When the verdict came, 7 years in prison for aggravated assault, my sons erupted in anger. They shouted at the judge, pleading for leniency, but it was no use. My daughters, seated beside me, clung to each other and sobbed uncontrollably. I wanted to comfort them, to hold them and tell them everything would be okay, but I knew it wouldn't be. My actions had taken away the man they looked up to, the man who had been their hero. They blamed me for his absence, and they were right to do so. I had shattered their world, and there was no undoing the damage. Even after the trial ended, the repercussions continued to ripple through our lives. My husband's absence left a void that I couldn't fill. My children avoided me whenever possible, their anger simmering just beneath the surface. My parents were divided. My mother tried to support me, though even her patience wore thin, while my father refused to acknowledge me at all. My brother, once my closest confidant, became my harshest critic, reminding me at every opportunity of the pain I had caused. I tried to reach out to my husband, sending letters and requesting visits, but he wanted nothing to do with me. Every letter was returned unopened, and every visitation request was denied. I was completely cut off from the man I had once vowed to love and honor. The realization that I had destroyed the best thing in my life was almost too much to bear. My lover, meanwhile, survived his injuries but would never be the same. His wife, whom I hadn't even known existed, sued me for alienation of affection, adding financial ruin to my growing list of failures. I lost my job due to the scandal, and no reputable firm would hire me. I was forced to take on menial jobs just to keep a roof over our heads, but even that wasn't enough to stop the bills from piling up. The life I had built over 2 decades was gone, replaced by a hollow existence filled with regret and loneliness. The family I had once taken for granted was now a distant memory, and every day I was reminded of what I had lost. Regret is a cruel tormentor, a constant reminder of the choices that led to ruin. After the trial, regret consumed every part of me, growing heavier with each passing day. I had destroyed my family, betrayed the love of my life, and shattered the trust of my children. The man I had once promised to honor and cherish was now behind bars, his life forever altered because of my selfishness. My children, my pride and joy, avoided me like the plague. Their silence spoke volumes, cutting deeper than any words ever could. At first, I tried to salvage what was left. I wrote letter after letter to my husband, pouring out my remorse, begging for forgiveness. Every word was a desperate plea, a hope that he might see my sincerity and give me a chance to make things right. But each letter was returned unopened, the rejection stinging like salt on an open wound. My visitation requests were repeatedly denied, the prison's cold bureaucracy reflecting the icy walls my husband had built around himself. My attempts to connect with my children were just as futile. They moved through the house like ghosts, silent and withdrawn. When I cooked their favorite meals, they grabbed their plates without a word and retreated to their rooms. On rare occasions when they did speak, it was curt and emotionless. I tried everything: apologies, heartfelt conversations, even bribery, but nothing worked. The damage I had done was too deep, and they weren't ready to forgive me. Financial struggles added another layer of misery. The lawsuit from my lover's wife drained the little savings I had left. My once stable career in accounting was over, my reputation ruined by the scandal. Every job interview ended the same way, with polite smiles and thinly veiled excuses as they turned me away. The shame of being labeled a homewrecker followed me everywhere, and soon, I was forced to take on menial retail jobs just to make ends meet. The house, once filled with laughter and love, became a prison of my own making. Each room was a painful reminder of what I had lost. The family dinners that once brought us together were now a solitary affair, the chairs around the table eerily empty. I often found myself sitting alone in the dark, the silence suffocating.